When you were building out e-commerce, especially in emerging markets, there was absolutely no playbook. And that meant that everything was very adaptable to our reality, our customer set, our stakeholders. Reinvention was the constant throughout.
Startups fight to survive. Scale-ups are different. These are the very few startups that take off like rocket ships. And of these, only a handful grow without becoming soul-destroying bureaucracies. And because there's so few of them, it's really rare we get to study their successes and their failures. So how does a hyperscaler pull this off? How do you sustain the energy to stay relevant year after year after year when it's so easy to coast and celebrate your success? Well, maybe the answer can be found, in antibodies, in ESQI jail, or the CEO crossroads. I'm Jimmy Allen, and this is Founders Mentality, the CEO Sessions. My guest today is Pedro Arnt. He's CEO of dLocal, a NASDAQ-listed payments company built for emerging markets. Think about it this way. It helps global giants like Amazon, Spotify, and Nike move money seamlessly in places where the payments are, anything but simple. Before that, Pedro spent 20 years at Mercado Libre, also known as Meli, Latin America's e-commerce giant. Co-founded and led by Marcos Galperin, you'll hear the name Marcos a lot today, Meli grew from a scrappy online marketplace to a $100 billion powerhouse. Now it spans 18 countries in e-commerce and fintech. And as chief financial officer, Pedro is in the cockpit of that rocket ship for that entire ride. Pedro, I think you've probably had more experience than any executive I'm aware of in a hyper-scaling period of a company. And I'd love just to understand from you, what were the biggest scaling challenges you guys faced at Meli?
So there were hundreds, I'm sure, but there's three that I think are the ones that we probably spent the most time on and were the most challenging ones. So the first one is massive consumer platform across an entire region. And so what were normally edge cases of consumer experiences gone afoul, when you actually looked at in terms of absolute numbers, they were massive. So the sheer scale of the business meant that it was extremely challenging, and you had to deal even with edge cases of consumer experience going afoul. Second thing, the beauty of a platform business is how powerful the go-to-market strategy becomes of being able to move into adjacencies. So Meli was a retail platform that was able to build on top of that one of the most successful neobanks in the region. The most successful logistics network is now moving into entertainment, so on and so forth. So from a business potential perspective, fascinating. Now the complexity creep of scaling up not one business, but scaling up multiple business units is massive, right? And then the third one is the age-old adage of the people who got you here are not the people that are going to get you there. And you have to make these difficult decisions, despite that meaning that a lot of loyal and contributors that were very instrumental for the phase you've just exited somehow probably had to be left by the wayside.
So how do you deal with that, given that it's an ongoing issue and you want to both thank the pioneers, but also make sure that they don't get in the way of the next stage? How do you do that?
If you're going to be a successful scale-up, I would say that almost for sure you have a very clearly defined culture. And that culture is not static, even as the requirements of your human capital and the type of personality you need to be successful changes. The culture immediately adapts and therefore singles out those that aren't fitting in. The system generates an antibody, and it becomes very easy for leadership, for the people organization to realize, because everyone's speaking up and saying, I don't think he's holding up his end of the bargain.
And my guess, I'm curious about this, is that probably wasn't a surprise to them, because you probably also had people that were often very self-aware and recognized they weren't ready for the next phase?
By and large, absolutely. And again, it goes to the antibodies. They had began to feel that in their interactions with peers and whatnot. Those exits, I think by and large, especially with the really important people, were never traumatic, to be quite honest. There were times where you could find roles for them within the organization where you could still leverage some of that DNA and those skills that they did have. Now, that's not always the case. Like if you just keep trying to find pockets to store away the old timers, then you're getting it wrong. The other thing that we did at Melli during a period, and that it's not easy, but I beyond recommend. I would say if you're not doing this, then you're going to have a hard time scaling up, is there should be a point in your company growth where you institute some form of stack ranking or forced curve, and you force your leaders to cull the lowest performers. It's only when you force them to stack rank and you force them to start on a scale, compare them amongst each other, that you begin to realize that a lot of those old timers consistently are falling to the bottom. At Melli, I think there was a period of maybe 6 or 7 years where the decision was the lowest performers is out.
As you were scaling and bringing in all these people, many of whom were better than the existing people, you're culling people that have been there. How did you keep the culture strong and the same? How did you keep the founder's mentality, the sense of insurgency as you keep bringing in these new people?
There was a moment where we were very deliberate about it. I remember a conversation we had where I was really worried because I said, we're growing too much, we're beginning to lose culture. And it was Marcos, actually. He said, look, 2 things. First of all, we're going to have to deliberately work on culture. We also need to realize that when you're growing to the size we're growing, law of large numbers starts creeping in. And so what we need to hold steadfast to is leadership. If we get leadership to really, really reflect the core cultural aspects of who we want to be, then that trickles down. So we may not be able to ensure in our maxim of hire for culture and fire for culture across the organization when it has more than 10,000 people. But at the leadership level, this is non-negotiable. And so when we got deliberate, the first one was hire for culture and fire for culture. So you actually built into your hiring process a final interview, which was mainly focused on cultural fit. And then the fire for culture is, I think my years have taught me that the famous case of the effective asshole who delivers the results, but everyone kind of knows is culturally misaligned, it inevitably over the long run doesn't work. I think we learned that one just from scars. The second piece is we were very, very consistent about baking in culture assessment into the quote unquote HR platforms. There was always a matching for, do they embody our leadership principles? Do they embody our culture, who we want our people to be? And then the third piece is you need to evangelize, right? The narrative around what Melli's culture is and what's important is really a key piece of the communication. In Marcos, that's so much of what he did is just remind people all the time of what those key cultural attributes are.
You know, scaling is tough. Culture slips, performance drifts. Every new recruit has dozens of new clever ideas that lead to a rainstorm of KPIs. To fight this drift demands clarity on what matters and a maniacal focus on those 1 or 2 things. And it starts with the leaders and their set of non-negotiables. So Pedro put in place stack ranking. Brutal, but effective. Cold, hard numbers that forced leaders to face reality, even when it meant parting ways with people they liked. During its hypergrowth phase, the leaders of Enterprise Rent-A-Car were also brutally clear on what mattered. For their former CEO, Andy Taylor, this was customer loyalty. Every branch was measured on one score, the Enterprise Service Quality Index, also known as ESQI, which is the percentage of customers who said they were completely satisfied. But here's the kicker. If your branch was below the company average, you and the whole branch were stuck in ESQI jail. Nobody got promoted. no exceptions. You could be the hardest worker in the room, but if your customers weren't satisfied, you are not going to be happy. That's focus. You say what you want, you measure it, you reward it. But there's a warning here. Focus is great when it's pointed in the right direction. But you also have to be open to new things, to be willing to change direction. If focus was Pedro's first leadership lesson, flexibility was his second.
I'd like to think that it's exactly the willingness and the self-consciousness and the commitment to changing that was the biggest change that I went through as a leader. I used to be damn stubborn, and I used to be the smartest guy in the room. And I think what I learned along the Melly journey is that you need to constantly reinvent yourself. And that means you need to be very open to learn. You need to be extremely willing to say what's working may not continue to work. And so I think it's the whole growth mentality mindset. Not only push yourself to that, but have the constant process of self-assessment and really questioning yourself to see, am I changing? Am I learning? Am I adapting? That was instrumental for us in that journey. We always say, right, when you were building out e-commerce, especially in emerging markets, there was absolutely no playbook. And I think that serves us brilliantly because it kept us away from standard solutions. And that meant that everything was very adaptable to our reality, our customer set, our stakeholders. Reinvention was the constant throughout.
For your own journey, is there a single leadership moment or moment of truth for you when you went from, I've got the answer, I'm the smartest guy in the room, to I'm vulnerable, I have questions, I'm curious?
I have an early anecdote, but it really ingrained something in me. My first job at Melly was business development, and this was in the heydays of the first internet bubble. And so we didn't have any revenue. We were pre-revenue. It was all about confirmed registered users. And you could IPO a company because you had a lot of confirmed registered users. And so I started, and Marcos sent me off to sign a deal with who was back then one of the largest portals, which was Lycos. You would pay Lycos, this massive amount of money. They would put you on their homepage, and then you'd get all these confirmed registered users. And so I signed this contract. It was this massive multi-million-dollar contract to have some sort of static link on the Lycos homepage. It would have been a massive misallocation of capital. Massive. I was 27 years old. And about 3 weeks after I signed the deal, and I had started to realize, they call me and they say, look, we have some uncomfortable news we need to relay to you, but we've just been bought by Telefónica. And the first thing the Spaniards are doing are reviewing all recent contracts. And so we may have to negotiate some way out clause on this. And I thought, this is my opportunity, right? And we got out of that contract. Sheer luck. It would have been millions of dollars thrown down the drain. And so little things like that, especially when you're dealing with excessive resources, I think start to make you realize, you know what? Be humble, learn, realize you're going to get it wrong, and be open about that because it's such a central part of the learning process.
Did you have a moment a decade or two later where there was a young Pedro who made the exact same mistake and that you were able to say, great, now you've got a lesson for life?
As a leader, I think this is interesting, but maybe this is where it comes from. There's this phrase, a poor plan well executed will almost always beat a good plan poorly executed. I always tell the people I work with that working with me is probably going to look a little bit like this. If there are 10 times that we disagree on the course forward, you're almost guaranteed to be told that 9 of them do it your way and I'm going to hold you accountable for the results. I believe that there's not one way to do things. There's probably multiple ways to get the result. And what's more important is the buy-in and the conviction when execution happens. So if people are executing my plan all the time, it doesn't work. There will be 1 out of 10 times where I will tell you, look, I'm really sorry. On this one, I will not cede, and you just need to disagree and go commit to my plan.
I love that one of the world's top executives talks about almost losing millions on his first deal. That's vulnerability. But second, I've become quite obsessed with the fact that most CEOs discover their step back moment. It's this crossroads. If they continue as is, they become the micromanager and start wearing the capes of the energy vampire. If they shift, if they step back, if they learn to trust each other, they redefine their role such that they're giving others wings. If anyone knows those crossroads, it's Ann Wright, founder of the Wright Approach. She spent 20 years coaching leaders. Think of her as a kind of CEO whisperer. Ann gets past the armor and she finds out what's really keeping leaders up at night and then helps them face those fears head on. And her first question to CEOs, well, it's old but gold. But she asks, what is it that only you can do?
It's an age-old question, but the what can only you do is increasingly important because people can get seduced about, now I'm CEO, I need to, and a lot of what they think they need to do isn't exactly what they need to do. Getting their teams in place is essential. If they came up within the organization, the most important role is the person who's replacing them. So they're not trying to do both jobs. And I have people do the exercise of, okay, if these are the 3 most important things you said you wanted to do, where is the time in your calendar for doing that?
You're saying it's increasingly important that they ask the question, what can only you uniquely do?
Yeah.
Why is it increasingly important? I'm just curious.
Because everybody will want them, right? When you come up through the ranks, all the people who think they're your friend or had a previous relationship with you, just, want a cup of coffee or want to drop in. And before you know it, you could spend your whole day doing that. So you have to change. And this thing about not being friends anymore or not being of the troops is quite hard. Because again, it's something that gets said all the time. It's lonely at the top, right? And people say it very glibly. It's really true. Once you are in that role, there isn't a single person in your organization you can tell everything to. I think there's something else around if people are feeling a bit overwhelmed, they want to go to the thing they really know how to do, right? I used to be the sales director and I'm really good at that, so I'll just go there and help. So I feel good, right? Which is a short-term gratification and in the long run, stop them from really thinking about the fact that their finance department needs attention, and that may not be their strength.
What I talk about a lot in the CEO forum is the problem of our time is that CEOs are exhausted. And if you're exhausted, you complicate.
Yeah.
Is that what you're seeing? Is when you're
Absolutely. Apparently there was a piece in the FT or something recently about how tenure for CEOs is getting shorter and shorter.
Yeah.
And some of that is energy. Interestingly, I just had this conversation with a client yesterday, and she said, I really thought I knew what I was getting into because she'd been so close to it for so long. And she said, I had no idea.
What unlocked my energy in my day job had nothing to do with my day job.
Exactly right.
And it was a specific moment when I was going down, I think, a very typical pattern and telling you that I'm in the wealth accumulation stage of my career, and then I'll be at the point that I can do things I love. And then you kind of ask, what's stopping you from doing both? And I then, went down to 80% and started my music businesses. Is that typical?
And sometimes I'll meet somebody and they've already got lots of interests. And one of my favorite stories is of a very senior lawyer who was also a concert pianist and a dressage competitor and a photographer and an artist and had 2 lots of children, an older lot and a younger lot. Astonishing, right? But he made it work because he got so much energy from those activities that he was even better in his, in quotes, day job. And he was inspiring to another generation that you could do both.
There are two things to unpack here. First, it is so critical that CEOs pick the right path at the crossroads. Do what only you, the CEO, can do, and then empower others to get on with their job. That's exactly the shift Pedro was describing. Second, take care of yourself. The job is lonely. The job demands more energy than you actually have. Now, most CEOs will tell you the biggest battle they fight every day is with their calendar. So the last thing they want to hear is some idiot saying, sign up for improv or take up sailing. But passions matter. Every leader we've heard on the podcast has said the same thing. An outlet outside of work doesn't drain your energy, it multiplies it. Don Katz plays ice hockey. Christina Zhu reads poetry. David Haynes rides motorcycles. Leaders need energy because exhausted leaders complicate. Because exhausted leaders allow their organizations to drift into irrelevance.
If you talk to Marcos, you talk to all of us who have been there since the beginning, it's not true that we were a customer-centric organization from the get-go, right? This was B2C. It was very hard to get that one voice of the consumer. But there was something else, which turns out is a phenomenal proxy for customer centricity, and that's product. So the one thing that was always core at Melli, and that was Marcos at one point moving to sit with the engineers to send a message to all of his leadership, product technology matters, and I want you involved in the details. Like, you couldn't say at Melli, oh, I've RFP'd this off to the product organization, ask them for the delivery date. If you were a leader and you weren't on top of what was working with the product, what wasn't working with the product, what the product roadmap was, you were not going to last there.
One of the things I talk a lot about is first fall in love with your product. The customer follows. This idea of customer first doesn't work, because if you don't have a great product that delights them, there's no point in doing customer research. But then let's just use product as a proxy. How did you keep that relentless focus on being great, being relevant to everybody in the marketplace?
Yeah. So the center of gravity within Melli was always around product and technology. The decisions were not made around the P&L. I always say I had the least relevant of all the C-level positions because I was the CFO. And then you had the business guys who were very important, but the real place where decisions were made were in product and technology. The second piece is there was always a strong element of long-term thinking, which I think also helps you to focus on the product and the experience. Then at one point, I'd say fairly early on in the journey, late 2000s, beginning of the teens, something else did begin to get introduced in a more mechanized and methodical way, which was the voice of the customer through very detailed listening and NPS, right? So because it's a large B2C platform, you could ask consumers, what do you like about the platform? What do you dislike about the platform? The customer service metric was actually instrumental because we started measuring per each journey within the customer experience where the NPS is higher and where the NPS is lower. And that feedback loop back into product, I think, became incredibly, incredibly powerful because you were looking at a data-driven enunciation of where consumers are complaining the most. Oh, it's the billing. Oh, it's the returns. Oh, it's the search, right? And then that was feeding back into product and tech teams and business teams, and that was the first metric to try to move.
And just on that, when you have this maniacal focus on the technology and product, this maniacal focus then on NPS, you end up with a culture where you have to love the idea that red is good, meaning that these problems are something we're going to embrace and celebrate. But every time I listen to you, every time I listen to Marcos, it is hard not to get exhausted with this relentlessness. How did you guys keep the energy levels going that the organization didn't just exhaust itself and fall over and collapse? What did you do about energy specifically?
We were working with these coaches, I remember, and actually people I respect a lot and I still use till this day. But at one point, they started veering some of the stuff they were trying to get us to do away from sort of these more engineer-like approaches to sort of conscious business and, esoteric is an unfair word, but softer areas of this stuff. And I remember getting pissed off and calling the partner in and saying, what are you doing? This is not what we want. We're an engineering type organization. And his concern was, he said, look, I worry you guys are going to burn out the motor. I'm looking at your organization, I'm working with you, and it's just too intense. And I think that was just not understanding what drove us. If you were to ask me what drives you in your business life, I think the answer would be seeing impact, seeing something that's broken, trying to fix it, designing something to fix it, and then actually seeing it get fixed. That's what keeps me walking into work every day so motivated. So I think when you have that kind of a group of people where impact and fixing and seeing things get better, that kind of intensity doesn't drain you. Quite the opposite. It energizes you. And then there's a second piece, which is related, which is we at Melli were very fortunate to see the results. We saw the results in the growth of the business. We saw the results in performance in terms of capital markets, recognition by peers. We'd always used to say, at first we had to explain to everyone what our company did. And then at one point, everyone used our company. So I think when you have that combination of people that are driven by wanting to fix things and wanting to have impact, and then you see the concrete results of that, that is not draining. That's incredibly energizing.
Guys, this is a mic drop moment. We are hearing a former CFO say that his job was the least important. What mattered was the folks in product and technology, because with them, the customers would follow. Second, we are hearing a CFO say that the one number that really mattered was NPS, Net Promoter Score, a system for feedback, recovery, action, not a financial number. Pedro's beginning to give us the shape of the new rules of scaling. Product and customer at the center. Execution matters more than management. A founder once told me after he had a meeting with a very polished HR recruit, he said the following: everything about the professional management system tells you that execution and keeping customer promises is a job to escape. Do it well and we'll promote you out of it. Well, I believe the opposite. I want executors free from admin and quote unquote management. I want them to get rich by being great at execution. We're so conditioned, we don't even realize how much our language and rewards say your job only matters if you leave it to become a manager. No wonder bureaucracies are soul crushing. As CEOs, the one thing you can't delegate is the job of putting the executor at the center. You have to celebrate them, and then you got to rewire the company around them. Because here's the twist. In bureaucracies, processes suffocate, and good leaders have to work around them. Paradoxically, in scale insurgents, they love process because it liberates the people who matter.
I think what attracted me to the current challenge of grabbing an earlier stage, publicly traded, very large organization, but much earlier stage than Melli, was that the scale-up phase is really what makes me tick. If someone were to give me a blank canvas of a company that was in that scale-up phase again, that actually needed the introduction of some elements of mechanization, that's exactly my pond. That's where I wanted to be. So that's what I hope to be bringing to dLocal at this point, which is we need to scale up, we need to become more mature, but we're going to do it in a way that works. And that means the right amount of process, which is probably little and indispensable, but it also means being acutely aware of honoring how it became the global South juggernaut that it is, to try to not break any of that. And by the way, Jimmy, it's a lot easier to narrate, a lot easier in theory than it is in practice. In practice, it is extremely difficult.
What's interesting listening to you today is you're describing bad processes as if it begins to erode the buy-in and the conviction of the person that's supposed to be benefiting from it, it's a bad process. If it's disempowering in the name of scale, it's a bad process. That's 23 years at Melee. That's not taught in any business book anywhere.
And it's just one small thought on that, which is this, is process has a very scary tendency to become an end in itself, when that's the exact opposite reason why you institute process. Where I learned that as a CFO is planning and budgeting. It's amazing how you look at most organizations and you'd think that the actual business moves in line with the budget and the processing, because companies spend months trying to do fortune telling. Months. And you have business unit leaders who, instead of running a business, are stressing and sweating the whole gaming around what my annual targets and my 3-year targets are going to be. So that to me was incredibly instrumental about how process becomes an end in itself, which is the last reason why you instituted process.
My example of that is HR, where you put in systems for your people so that they support your people, so that promotion processes are not capricious, et cetera. But then you go into a review meeting and someone says, yes, Jack is a superstar, but we can't double promote him because it will erode the integrity of our system. And you're like, why does the system suddenly become more important than Jack? And yet you hear it in every performance review meeting in every room around the world.
And that's the other thing. I observe my leaders and my team a lot to see how they deal with mechanization and process. And I think there's two extremes. There are those that very quickly devolve into the process is what I am here for. And I think the HR is a great example. The second thing is, in a lot of startups at the scale-up phase, you also have those early stage people that worked entirely in the absence of process and say, process is crap, I want none of it. And both extremes you have to identify quickly and probably get rid of. What you need is to find the people that really understand how mechanization of an organization has to serve the ultimate purpose, which is the end user, the merchant, the consumer. And I'm very deliberate about observing how my people deal with process when it's introduced, because you need to start figuring out, as a big part of who is equipped for a scale-up phase, how they are able to work with process.
Listen, before I go to our final, because we're out of time, to the final list of fun questions, is there anything you wished I had asked you or that you wanted to say?
We had a conversation the other day that made me reflect on something. And it's this notion of the moments of truth, or the big moments around my career where big decisions were made and they were a turning point. I thought long and hard about this. I was trying to come up with a list of these, and I kept resisting it. And then I realized why I resisted it, Jimmy, because I think that what happens in that moment of truth is not that relevant. It's everything you were doing the previous 10 or 15 years, the little things, the things that you would bore the crap out of people if I had to narrate them on the podcast, which actually made it work at that moment. And the reason I say this is, and I remember I was at Melly when this happened. So when COVID hit, we went into this immediate sort of cost cutting, what to get rid of. And then we started looking at the data, and obviously e-commerce, the business was just taking off like it had never taken off, right? And so we talked a lot about what made that possible. How smart were we around the COVID decisions and this and that? And the conclusion was, the reason Melly hit escape velocity is because of what it had been building the prior 10 years. Those moments of truth are a consequence of everything you did before. We shouldn't be highlighting the moment of truth. We should be highlighting all that work that went in to when that big, big moment happens, the company being able to take advantage of that.
2 quick points. First, Hyperscalers love process. They just rejected the processes of the professional management system. Second, I think it's worth pausing on Pedro's insight on moments of truth. He notes that greatness isn't one breakthrough, one moment. It's actually the result of thousands of decisions that create the foundation for that moment. And on the Founders Mentality site, we've tried to collect lots of stories of other CEOs talking about that journey, the journey where you restore primacy to the people who keep customer promises, and then the magic starts. So hit the show notes. Now, let's get back to Pedro and a round of rapid fire questions. What brings you energy?
Learning more than anything else.
What drains you of energy?
Self-interested people, and what kills me the most, false agenda-driven conversations. So conversations about A when really what's going on is C.
This brings the next one. Do you have energy vampires that you have to encounter in your work? And if so, how do you deal with them?
That. It's the non-straight shooters and the people who are not really saying it as it should be. Eventually, those people are very, very bad for any organization, and they shouldn't be around. Fortunately, I've worked at organizations, again, where the cultures were right, and so the entire organization had antibodies for those people, and so the culture itself takes care of it.
What's the best advice you ever received?
Look at the movie and not the picture. Direction of travel matters more than where you are at a specific point in time. And that has been incredibly useful for me when it comes to sort of looking at where we are and maintaining the rudder steady. Are we at least moving in the right direction?
All right, let's recap the key takeaways from our conversation with Pedro.
We're going to have to deliberately work on culture. We also need to realize that when you're growing to the size we're growing, law of large numbers starts creeping in. And so what we need to hold steadfast to is leadership.
The risk that comes with scaling is that culture fades. We've got to be intentional. Culture isn't something you do to the rest of the organization. It actually starts with how leaders act.
It's not true that we were a customer-centric organization from the get-go, but there was something else which turns out is a phenomenal proxy for customer centricity, and that's product.
No matter how big our companies get, it's always possible to find a way back to the voice of the customer. And for Melee, that journey begins with the product and the teams that make it.
When you have that combination of people that are driven by wanting to fix things and wanting to have impact, and then you see the concrete results of that, that is not draining. That's incredibly energizing.
The right culture and mission always energizes. It attracts energy givers and creates antibodies against energy vampires. That's how companies stay relevant. How about leaders? Focus your personal journey on these two questions. What can I uniquely do? And what passions must I pursue to re-energize? Because sometimes playing ice hockey or reading poetry, that's the secret to leadership. Scale insurgents are rare. They keep their founder mentality while also giving customers the benefits of their size. They win in a turbulent world because they're using new rules for scaling. And that's why we're sticking with Mercado Libre. It's a rare scale insurgent. And in our next episode, we're going right to the top. We'll be talking directly to Marcus Galperin, co-founder and executive chairman of Mercado Libre. So we'll be back in 2 weeks. Until then, stay curious.